Welcome, everybody. My name is Tamara Staten. I am CCL's Education and Resilience Coordinator. I'm also our Regional Coordinator for the Pacific Northwest. And Core Volunteer Training is a program of the Citizens Climate Lobby, and we are here to help you achieve your goals, your climate advocacy goals. So wonderful to have you here. We get to hear from three esteemed speakers tonight. So the objectives of this session are threefold. First, you will likely learn about the brand new 2020 household impact study that shows the financial benefits of the Energy Innovation Act to U.S. households. Second, we hope that you will learn about why we are certain that HR 2307's base carbon price can achieve net zero emissions, while also increasing gross domestic product and job opportunities. And thirdly, we hope that you can learn about new evidence that the Energy Innovation Act yields tremendous net climate and health benefits. It's good for the economy and for society. So I get to introduce three speakers this evening from our fabulous research department. Rick is CCL's research coordinator. Jerry Hinkle is our economic research coordinator. Dana Nucitelli is our newest research coordinator. Welcome, Dana. Super happy to have you on staff. All right, so those are our esteemed speakers this evening. Before I pass it over to them, here's what we're doing this evening. First, we're going to dive into the 2020 household impact study. Then we're going to talk about carbon price yields and getting us to net zero by 2050. We will then move into policy costs versus policy benefits, follow that up with health impacts and the IPCC report, and have Q&A discussions between each of the three speakers. So our agenda is not exactly in chronological order, but that's the general gist of what we will be doing this evening. And with that, I pass it over to Rick.
Thanks, Tamara. I can't see my notes, so I'm going to be winging it, but that should be no problem. So I'm going to talk about the 2020 household impact study. Some of you may have already been familiar with this. I gave a talk on this last August when it was brand new. We hired a fellow named Kevin Ummel, a data scientist, to look at the impact of the carbon fee and dividend patterned on the Energy Innovation Act on American households. So just to kind of review how this works, let me change my view here so I can see the whole slide. You know how the carbon fee and dividend works. A fee is put on coal, oil, or gas. That's paid into a fund. And of course, the customers for those fuels, the utilities from refineries, the manufacturers of various kinds, they're going to pay higher costs for those fuels. And naturally, they'll try to pass some of that cost, at least, onto their customers, who are you and I and other households, in the form of the energy that we buy, gasoline, electricity, heating, fuel, and all the products that we buy, which have some carbon embedded in their manufacture. So how do we close the loop here? In the carbon fee and dividend plan, dividends are allocated back to households equally per capita to cover those costs and to reward people who use less energy, and those who use more will have to think about whether they want to change their behavior. So the purpose of this study was to find out, how does this work out for people? Now, the basics of the study, it was modeled, as I said, on the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, a carbon fee being $15 per metric ton of CO2 equivalent, meaning that the fee is put on the fuel based on the amount of CO2 and other greenhouse gases that will be emitted when it is used in its normal fashion. This only covers year one, because it was the analyst that we hired did not feel that he could properly model the changes that would take place after that, because behavior changes and technologies change. So it's only covering that first year. Based on some research that we found between 2016, and when the first household impact study was released, and 2020, we found that there's a lot of evidence that not all of those costs are passed on to consumers. It varies by industry, but we came up with an average of about 85% based on some research that we had consulted. The household results are based on consumption rather than income, and I'll explain a little more about that later. And then the emissions and economic data are taken from the years 2017 to 2019. So that's the foundation of the study. So let's get into the study results. Now, this slide, I want to show you how those costs break down, the carbon cost and how the dividends look. So looking at it by quintile, each quintile is 1/5 of the population ranked by household consumption. And again, consumption is actually the amount of money that a household spends on goods and services. A little bit different from income because some households actually spend more than their income if they're drawing on retirement income or some other source of income. So this is something that Kevin Ummel felt is a more accurate reflection of how the carbon costs will stack up against dividends. So the first category, direct energy costs. These are fuels and electricity that we buy directly from suppliers, such as gasoline that we buy at the pump, and electricity that you pay in your electric bill, and home heating fuel. Those are basically the three direct energy costs. And as you can see, dollars per year of average household, it varies from about a little over $100 at the lowest quintile to a little bit close to $250 in the wealthiest quintile of the population. Now, direct energy costs are not the whole picture. There are indirect energy costs. Those are in everything else we buy, not the direct energy that we purchase directly. So in the goods and services, clothing, food, healthcare, entertainment, and so on, and other travel, such as air travel, that, as you can see, is a substantial amount. And for the higher income folks, it's actually more than their direct energy costs. So what's the last piece of the puzzle here? It's actually financial asset costs. This is the 15% that is passed back to investors instead of that 85% passed down to consumers. And so that, as you can probably understand, is a very small slice of people in the lowest quintile, but it's a pretty substantial amount of money that is borne, the costs that are borne by the people with the most money invested in stocks and bonds and retirement accounts and so on. So the question is, how does this stack up against the dividends? Now, recall that carbon dividends are considered taxable income. So you'll see what that means. Here's what the dividends look like for households. This is nationwide average results. So as you can see, the lowest quintile, the poorest households, will get about $514 in dividends versus $273 in costs. These numbers are the total of stacked up portions of the costs here. So the second quintile and the third quintile still come out ahead. For the fourth quintile, meaning people in the top 80% of from 20 to 80% of income, they're pretty much in a break-even range, a little bit more of cost than of benefits. And then finally, the people in the richest quintile, they end up paying a little more than, quite a bit more. This is on an annual basis. So the dividends more than cover costs for the bottom three quintiles. And I want to point out too that for people in the top quintile, even though it looks like they're taking a big hit, it's a very small percentage of their total income. Generally less than about 0.3 or 0.4%. And you'll see how that works out in the next couple slides. Now, so how did the households do in this study based on economic quintile? 61% of households came out ahead overall. And you can see that by quintile, it's quite a bit of difference. And what we mean by coming out ahead is they definitely, the median of dividends exceed the household costs. Another 24% experience what we call a minor loss, which is really only about 0.2%. So you can kind of look at this as being in the range of breaking even for the year. In the bottom quintile, as I said, 96%. Almost everyone comes out ahead. A very small percentage are in that break-even range. And even at the top, there are plenty of ways to turn a loss into a gain. You know, this is not a result that's tied directly to a family's income. It's tied to the amount of energy that they use. And people in the highest quintile use about 3 times the amount of energy as people in the lowest quintile. So if this wealthy family really wants to save on money, they can, put solar panels up and buy an electric vehicle and so on. Another way of breaking this down is how households do according to the age of the household. And in this, how gains are concentrated in the youngest and oldest households, as you would expect, because people in the lower income households potentially use less energy, and they're in the time of maximum earnings, and they have larger families because, as you may know, the dividends are allocated to adults and then half share to children. So large families with many kids tend to do a little better. But even in the 65 to 80 range, where some of us here may actually fall into that range, more than half of households do well. And 80 and above, because they are collecting Social Security and retirement income. So with reduced mobility and low consumption with fixed incomes, older households tend to use less energy. Now, here's something that we got a lot of questions about from our volunteers and from congressional offices. What about urban versus rural? There is a general impression that rural households are going to do badly because they have much farther distances to drive than people who are living in the city who have access to public transportation. It turns out that this is not really the outcome that we end up with. Very little difference between rural, suburban, and urban communities. From 60 to 59 to 63% come out ahead. And what are the reasons for this? Longer travel distances in rural areas are offset by other factors, such as a generally lower cost of living. Anybody who's lived in a city center knows how expensive goods and services are, particularly housing. Now, district level results may depend on community composition, because if this is a congressional district that is completely urban, there's very little data on the rural population, but this is the outcome on a national basis. As far as race and ethnicity is concerned, this is another way that Kevin Hummel broke down the data. People of color benefit in larger proportions than white households. These effects are due to lower economic status and larger, younger families in general. As you can see, Latino families tend to do the best. So these outcomes are inherent in the policy design. There's nothing in this policy that specifically race-based targeting. It's just a consequence of economic status. And finally, there's another way that the study broke down these data. The majority of people in groups flagged as most vulnerable, such as people in poverty, low income, minority, family of 4, older adults, and single parent families. People who are flagged as most vulnerable generally have a pretty substantial net gain, with poverty, meaning people below the poverty line, and low income, meaning people below double the poverty line, they're most benefited. Older adults cover a wide range of economic status, so they're not quite as widely benefited. So how do you find this information if you really want to read the study and delve into it a little deeper. Under our CCL resources, if you go to the home page and click on our climate solution, you'll see price on pollution studies. And if you click on that, that takes you to this page. And if you scroll down, you will find the 2020 household impact study. And that gives you access to some nice resources, a 2-page summary that you can share with anyone you want to, which could be a congressional office, it could be an endorser. You can read the full household impact study if you want, and there's a nice substantial FAQ document that's also associated with the study. So now there are some other resources. These are really important if you're into lobbying. State and district handouts, which are available on community under resources. There's a household impact study set of resources, and these are 4-page handouts that show the data by district or by state. It takes you to a Google Drive where you can pick out the handout that you want, which was put together by CCL. We've done some laser talks on this topic. Actually, it shouldn't be new laser talk. That was from last year. And then there's the personal carbon dividend calculator, which some of you may be familiar with. Well, this proves that the policy is good for people. This detailed demographic analysis could be very important, explains the reason for our confidence in $15 rising carbon tax. And I'm going to stop there.
Thanks for coming tonight, folks. The first thing that I want to go over with you is what is the carbon price in the US that would achieve this lofty goal that everyone's talking about, Biden, et cetera, net zero by 2050. So a study set about doing exactly that. Prior to this, most modeling tried to answer the question, give me a carbon tax and I'll tell you what the emission reductions are that will stem from that. But this one said, wait a minute, let's let policymakers set the objective, like net zero by 2050, and we'll give you the carbon price. Us, analysts, the modelers, will give you the carbon price that'll get it done. So the screen to your left, and I don't think I can do. So anyway, I'll just have to talk about it because I don't.
You can, Jerry. Jerry, if you
Oh.
mouse over that bottom left section on your screen,
Bottom left,
three dots, and then
Yep,
you'll see laser. Turn on the laser pointer.
Turn on.
There it is.
Woohoo! I love laser pointers. So to the left here are the emission reduction scenarios that get you to net 40. Pretty straightforward, right? Net zero by 2040, 50, and 60. Obviously, 40 will require a higher carbon price. We're going to focus here on 2050 and what does it take to get there. So looking to the right here, we're going to focus on the blue bar. And this is going to tell us what carbon price we need by 2025 to put us on the path to net zero by 2050. And we see that's about $50. And so I can't see that part of my screen. By 2030, the price required is a little over $100. Well, lo and behold, this is a really interesting result for Citizens Climate Lobby because we've long advocated for the Energy Innovation Act. And if the price were to start this year, the price would be about $55 in 2025 and about $105 in 2030. So the policy that we've been advocating for, which is a really strong, ambitious carbon price, is actually adequate to attain this very lofty and important goal of net zero by 2050. Good to know, because there's a lot of people espousing these objectives, but it's a lot harder to come up with a plan to get you there. Now I want to talk about global carbon prices. The UN was also very concerned with this question. If we did it via a carbon price, what would it take? Okay, and the objective that they set out was to stay at or below 2 degrees centigrade temperature rise, also a very important objective. So they assembled a commission of just top-notch climate economists. these economists did a broad survey of the literature. So this is considered a pretty authoritative study, and it's been referenced by a number of important groups. Okay, here's the key result that the high level commission on carbon prices came up with. It would require a global carbon price, so at least all the major emitters, right, to embrace a carbon price between $50 and $100 a ton to stay on track for 2C. Okay. Since then, so that study came out in 2017. Since then, the IMF has begun calling for a minimum global carbon price. So they're saying, look, we need to get serious about climate change. Let's have, especially all the major emitters, commit to at least a minimum carbon price. And what they're talking about is completely consistent with this study, which is a price of $75 a ton by 2030. So one thing I would leave you with there is both for the US and globally, this type of policy, a carbon price can get us there. Always good to have help. Always good to subsidize renewables, have money set aside for R&D from the government. These are very good things. We appreciate complementary policies, but by and large, the carbon price is the most efficient, effective way to get there, and it's really getting a lot of attention in the national and local community. Okay, now I'm gonna move off of mostly carbon pricing, and I wanna talk about not theoretical, but what is before us now. And the key policies that are before us now are those being considered by the Senate Finance Committee as part of the reconciliation process. Literally, these may well be finalized over the next 3 weeks. Well, I believe it was the Senate Finance Committee that asked Resources for the Future to do an analysis of specified policies. And we think it's because these are the policies they're considering. Okay, so I'm going to look at 3 of them. There's more, and Dana, who's next, has written a great blog, and it's coming out Thursday. You'll see a little bit more about this on Thursday. Look out for that. But here are the 3 policies. There was something called the Clean Energy for America Act, CEAA, and it's tax incentives for all things green. Okay, very often these policies can be divided into 2 categories. Carrots, right? And this is a carrot. This is a prime example of a carrot. And a carrot is, we're going to pay you to do the right thing. So we're going to cut your taxes to go green. Okay, EV, get a big reduction, etc. Okay, the second policy that they looked at is called the Clean Energy Performance Program. This is essentially a clean energy standard in the power sector only. Power sector right now in the US is about 26% of total emissions. So it's not everything, but it's the easiest to decarbonize. Okay, and this program would essentially call it a mix of carrot and stick, but it's a lot of carrot in that the US government is going to pay utilities to embrace clean energy. Specifically, they'll give you an objective of increasing the amount of fuels that are from clean sources by 4% a year. And every year you meet or exceed that, you get a payment. If you fall short of that, you pay a fee. Okay. And the objective here in this particular program is 80% clean energy in the power sector by 2030. And then a carbon tax. We're going to look at a carbon tax as well. Interesting. Check out this carbon tax. $15 a year to start in 2023. Over the course of 5 years, it goes up to $30 a ton. So from 15 to 30 over 5 years, you know, kind of an average of $3 a year, kind of a slow increase. Initially, you're giving folks a chance to adapt, to go green before you get hit with the big tax. And then starting in 2028, you're going up $10 a year. So sound familiar? In fact, let me put a quick question into the chat. I want you, it's audience participation time. Who do you think the Senate Finance Committee is listening to when they've gone about designing their carbon tax. Any names, anything familiar? And I'm going to have to open up chat to see.
I
what
can
kind
let
of
you know,
answers.
Jerry, what people are
Please.
saying. So what
Who do you
what
think?
all
Who they're
think?
listening to?
This might sound familiar, it might not. Sanders, Ben, thanks. Anybody else have any guesses as to who the Senate Finance Committee might be listening to? I could give you a clue. There are 3 letters.
Okay.
It's an acronym, starts with a C.
And ends with an L.
L.
So, and look, we don't really know, but wow, this sure does sound familiar to folks that have been running around this organization for a while. And that's nice. And I think it also, what they're doing is putting together something that works for them. But obviously, it sounds like somebody's listening to us and appreciating our work out there. I'll move on. Enough gloating. Now, I don't really think you can get enough gloating. I'm having trouble. Oh, look at that. So let's look at the results of the RFF study. Okay, and what we're looking at here is, first of all, let's start with what are the emission reductions relative to 2005 by the year 2030. Why do I use that? Biden set the big goal. We want 50% reductions relative to 2005 by 2030. Now note there's a reason 2005, a lot of emissions that year, make it a little easier to reduce relative to that, right? So we're already at 23%, or said in other ways, current policy will get us to a reduction of 23% by 2030. You only need another 27% to achieve Biden's goal of 50%. So the combination of the tax incentives and the clean energy standard get you a bit further to 39%. That's the blue line here, okay? And you see it's kind of kinked, it comes down, but it does a nice job of reducing emissions by 2030. Doesn't do a lot after that, though. The blue line, in fact, it looks like it's going in the opposite direction. The carbon tax reduces more. It reduces emissions by 45% by 2030. Why? It's economy wide. So it's not going to just go after the power sector. Now the tax incentives would go beyond, but mostly the reductions are coming from this clean energy standard, and it's affecting mostly the power sector. So we go a little bit further with a carbon tax. If you combine the two, okay, the carbon tax and these two, more carrot policies, you get to 52%. So you can get that with a combination of these policies. Now, there's much more of a difference made between the two policies after 2030. Not surprising, the carbon tax kicks in. The green line is the carbon tax. There you go, down 45% by 2030. But you keep reducing because that carbon tax is getting more and more expensive, whereas this combination of policies does not keep reducing. As a result, by 2040, much bigger difference. But this combination of policies, you're still in the mid 30s, right? Didn't get you any further. The carbon tax has gone from 45% to 60% reductions, combined a little bit higher than the carbon tax. In fact, this other policy isn't doing you a lot of good at that point because the carbon tax is getting it done, is what's happening there. So interesting. Those are the emission reductions from the policies that the Senate Finance Committee is currently talking about. I'm only going to take a couple more minutes, but I want to talk about GDP because one of the arguments in the past we've most heard is it's a job killer. It'll wreck the economy. And there's a tiny bit of truth to it in that if you're in an industry that pollutes more, you're definitely going to be disadvantaged by a carbon tax. But what this study is going to show us, and it's a fabulous study, came out about a year ago from the IMF, okay? And what this shows is, in fact, strong climate policy, if it's the right policy, actually increases GDP. So let's go to the slide on the left and the USA here. We got 3 different 2-year time periods. 2021 to 23, 36 to 38, 50 to 52. So it takes us to mid-century. And if you include the policy and the sum of the health and climate benefits, you'll see that the black dots are above the line. This policy, which is basically CF&D with a little bit of green subsidy and infrastructure, increases GDP. This is a big deal. Doesn't hurt the economy, not overall, okay? They'll also say, you're gonna lose some jobs in polluting industries, but you're gonna gain more jobs than you lose. It's a net job creator, okay? It's good for the economy. And that's to 2050. It's especially good out longer term to 2100. This would be a good opportunity for a question in the chat. Why is that? I'll answer the question. It's because climate change will be brutal on the economy, the world economy, especially in the second half of the century. It's going to be nasty. So wreck the economy. To wreck the economy, you don't address climate change. Okay, so what this graph is showing you is the increase in GDP, and look at the red bar. So GDP by the end of the century is about 15% higher if you take action, use a CF&D policy to mitigate climate change. Okay, that I think that's all I'm going to say about this, and I'm going to go to questions. Here's the quote in the IMF study, and I think Tamara's putting that study in chat and the other studies in chat. And you can always write to me, Jerry at citizensclimatelobby.org, if you've got questions on this stuff. So I'm going to skip over this stuff. Let me go to resources. So there's a great laser talk. There's the Economics Policy Network in community. It's an action team. Go to action teams and EPN, a lot of great material on this. And there's a paper that you can just do a search for on community called Economic Benefits of Carbon Fee and Dividend. We did a 6-week course. We really did a deeper dive into how this increases jobs, increases GDP, greatly enhances our health, and stabilizes climate risk. This is really good policy that we're advocating for. Okay, and I'm going to take questions from there. So there's how you get to action teams. Dana, take it away.
Okay, sounds good. Let me see if I can get the slide shared. There we go. So as Jerry said, we're going to have a post on the CCL blog on Thursday talking about these studies that are evaluating what the various policies in the budget reconciliation plus what a carbon tax can do. Basically, they all agree that those other policies can get you most of the way to our 50% by 2030 target, but you need a carbon tax to get the rest of the way. So Thursday, we should have that on the CCL blog. So I'm going to talk about the latest IPCC report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, kind of the key take-home points from that. Just going to pop over those really quickly. So the IPCC report, every 5 to 8 years, the UN kind of brings together the top climate scientists in the world to summarize the latest, greatest climate science research. So this first volume that came out just a couple weeks ago, it's called The Physical Science Basis. And there's also going to be reports or sections on impacts and solutions, and then a synthesis volume coming early next year. So all we have right now is the physical science basis stuff. So one of the key findings in the report is basically that humans are most likely responsible for all the global warming we've seen over the past 150 years since the Industrial Revolution. So the best estimate is that we've seen about 1.1 degrees Celsius, which is about 2 degrees Fahrenheit, warming in global average surface temperatures since the late 1800s. And the best estimate is that humans have caused about 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming since late 1800s. So basically, roughly 100% of the warming we've seen is due to humans. And natural factors are responsible for plus or minus 10%, plus or minus 0.1 degrees Celsius no significant impact over the past 150 years from natural factors. So that's one key finding that it's actually not a new finding. It was actually a conclusion of the last IPCC report in 2013, 2014, but it's something that most people, I think, still don't realize. So it's a good thing to be able to communicate to people that, yes, humans are responsible for all the warming we've seen since the Industrial Revolution. And then the IPCC report also had a lot of information about various types of extreme weather having become more intense in various regions due to human-caused climate change. And I think we have a poll that we're going to ask, basically asking people what categories of extreme weather they have experienced directly. So we got a lot of people feeling heat waves. That's not surprising. As temperatures go up, we get more heat waves. Probably got a lot of people along the Gulf Coast because we're getting a lot of hurricane impacts, a lot of flood impacts. Some wildfires probably for most folks in California, or possibly people across the country getting the smoke from our wildfires, and quite a few droughts probably in the Southwest. So yeah, a lot of different impacts that people are feeling. All right, so we're going to talk about what the IPCC reports said about those. So let's see that go away. Okay, so yeah, a lot of people said they're feeling an increase in heat waves, and that is a really direct impact of global warming, increasing extreme heat. So as we get temperatures rising, that also causes extreme heat to rise and become more frequent and more intense. And so this chart on the right side of the slide is from the IPCC report. It's showing what used to be an extreme once in 50-year heat events, extreme heat wave in the late 1800s. So it's happening once per 50 years. What it looks like now. So now we've seen a little over 1 degree Celsius warming since then. And so now what used to be a once per 50-year heat wave is now happening once per decade. So it's 5 times more likely than it was about 150 years ago. And if we get to 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, which is kind of the more ambitious Paris target, we'll see that same heat wave happen once every 6 years. If we hit 2 degrees Celsius, which is kind of the upper end of the Paris target, we'll see that same heat wave happen once every 4 years. And if we get to 4 degrees Celsius, which is kind of a catastrophic warming, total failure of global climate policy, we'll see that same heat wave happen almost every year, once per 1.3 years. So what used to be a once per 50-year event now happens almost every year. So yeah, heat waves really become a lot more extreme as a result of global warming. So next category is extreme precipitation. So there's this relationship that for every 1 degree Celsius global warming we get, the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere increases by 7% or so. And so we've already seen 1 degree Celsius warming, and so there's now 7% more water vapor in the atmosphere than there used to be. And then you get heavier precipitation events because there's more water vapor in the atmosphere, and that causes worse flooding. So this change isn't as an extreme a change as we just saw with the heat waves, because it's 1 degree Celsius, a 7% increase. It's not as a radical of a change. And so again, you can see a similar chart from the IPCC report on the right side of the slide here. So what used to be in the late 1800s, a once per decade events, extreme precipitation events, now happens once every 8 years. If we get to 1.5 degrees Celsius, it happens once every 7 years. If we hit 2 degrees Celsius, it happens once per 6 years. And if we get to 4 degrees Celsius, it happens once per 4 years. So again, it's not as extreme of a change as we see with heat, but nevertheless, we're getting both extreme precipitation becoming wetter and very extreme rain events happening a little more frequently as temperatures rise because of this increase in water vapor in the atmosphere. Next category is extreme drought. So when you have higher temperatures, that dries out the soil, and that's kind of the category of drought that we're looking at. It's called agriculture and ecological drought, which is basically when stuff dries out. So when you have higher temperatures, that of course exacerbates droughts in areas that are already drought prone. And it's kind of similar to the change in extreme precipitation, but a little bit larger. So again, you can see the similar chart on the right. So 150 years ago, what used to be a once per decade extreme drought events is now happening once every 6 years. If we get to 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming, it happens twice as often as it used to, once per 5 years. At 2 degrees Celsius, a little more often, once per 4 years. And if we hit 4 degrees Celsius, It happens once every 2 to 3 years. So, as you have temperatures rising, everything dries out, and these droughts, extreme droughts, just happen a bit more frequently as it gets hotter and drier. Then we got wildfires. So the IPCC report looked at what they call extreme fire weather conditions, which is when it's hot and dry and windy, because those are the conditions when a wildfire gets sparked. If it's really hot and dry and windy, the wildfire spreads explosively much faster and further than it would have otherwise. And so those conditions are becoming more frequent. So their estimate was that if we get 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, we'll get almost a week longer in the fire season. If we get to 2 degrees, it's almost a week and a half longer in the fire season. And if we get to 4 degrees, then you get a really big change. The fire season becomes almost 2 months longer on average. So this is one reason why this 2 degrees Celsius limit is something that we really want to try not to go beyond, because once you get beyond that point, these impacts can become really severe, because in this case, it's becoming both hotter and drier. And so those really create bad conditions that last for a long time during the year for wildfire seasons to become really explosive and long and dangerous. And then the last one I think we got is hurricanes. So what the IPCC report found is that hurricanes are becoming more powerful. They are intensifying more rapidly, and they're also moving more slowly. So basically, we're seeing more of these hurricanes become category 4 and 5. They're also, as they go across the ocean, because the ocean waters are hotter, hotter ocean water basically acts as fuel to power hurricanes. And so as a hurricane goes for a tropical storm, goes across really warm water, it speeds up and becomes a hurricane much faster than it used to. And there's also this effect that hurricanes are moving more slowly across the ocean and the land, which seems to be related to climate change, although climate scientists aren't exactly sure about the mechanism. They're still researching that. But a good example is Hurricane Harvey a few years ago kind of got stuck in one place over the Houston area and just dumped rain for days on end on the Houston area and caused really severe flooding and other impacts because it wasn't moving along as fast as hurricanes used to. So what the IPCC report estimated was that if we hit 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, we'll see 10% more hurricanes reaching those really high, dangerous category 4 or 5 levels. At 2 degrees Celsius, it becomes 13%. At 4 degrees Celsius, it becomes 20% more hurricanes reaching those really dangerous category 4 or 5 levels. So it doesn't sound like a whole lot, but every year we get 10 to 20 named storms in the Atlantic Ocean. And so, that means if you have 10% more hurricanes reaching category 4 or 5, that's 1 or 2 more hurricanes per year, becoming these really dangerous category 4 to 5 levels. And so if you live in a hurricane zone, that's like really dangerous. So you're getting 1 or 2 more of these really dangerous hurricanes every year. So really quickly, I'm going to also touch on the health benefits of climate policy from some good research by this climate scientist at Duke named Drew Shindell. So he's doing some really good research on the impacts of air pollution and extreme heat on health. So he testified about his preliminary results to Congress about a year ago, and his paper is now on the verge of being published. It should be published within the next couple of weeks, I think. So basically what he found was that the health benefits of reducing heat and air pollution, extreme heat and air pollution, are very high. He found that meeting the Paris target of staying below 2 degrees Celsius global warming would prevent roughly 4.5 million premature deaths, avoid about 3.5 million hospitalizations and emergency room visits, and avoid approximately 300 million lost work days in the US over the next few decades. And adding this all up, the economic benefits of avoiding all those impacts is about $700 billion per year for the USA and improved health and labor. A lot of that is in the value of preventing premature deaths, which we put high value on for good reason. So $700 billion per year is more than enough to pay for the clean energy transition by itself. And so basically it's very, very valuable to slow climate change and implement climate policies from a health perspective, according to his research.
Any questions? Jerry Hinkle, you can find him at jerry.hinkle@citizensclimate.org, rick.knight@citizensclimate.org, and Dana Nucitelli, I will put his name. Another place you can pose questions is on CCL's community forums at community.citizensclimate.org/forums. And then as they discuss, the Economics Policy Network is also a fabulous place to go. So thank you so much for everything that you are doing, for your presence this evening, for your commitment, for your interest, and have a wonderful evening. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, Tamara.
You're welcome. Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.